So, welcome. This is a bit of a free-flowing session, and it's fantastic because we have Dickon, who is head of the BUP, bladder...
Urothelial. And,
Thank you.
Come on, you can say the words.
I know. I'm getting there. And penile cancer group. Arun, who is prostate cancer oncologist, as well as being the chair of the translational subcommittee. And Louise, who is theragnostic, lutetium, actinium, everything extraordinaire on our panel. As I say, I've been given very little... we're allowed to do whatever we want, I think. Is that it, Mark? Within reason. So I guess what I'd like to do is start with each of our panellists and say, what do you think is the most exciting 2 things in your area in the last 12 months? And then we've got lots of things we could talk about, but I think it would be really nice if we took some questions from the audience as well. People happy with that? So, Louise, do you want to start? I mean, apart from the fact that, of course, ANZUP rules the ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology oral session with therapy and enzymet, what do you think is the most exciting thing in theranostics? And probably explain theragnostics for the audience first.
Yeah, it's a weird spiritual religion. So actually, theranostics is actually a composite word. It's therapy and diagnostics, and it really relates to these small proteins that have been developed that bind to cancer cells, and we can use them both to image the cancer cells, so we can see exactly on PET scans where the cancer cell is. We get a lot of information about the cancer cell, and we can look for treatment response, and then we can attach a nuclear warhead. And we've got a few different types of nuclear warheads that we can attach to these small peptides, and they can enter the cell and then kill the cell. So what ANZUP has done, which I think has just been phenomenal, was got involved very, very early in the space, particularly in prostate cancer with theranostics, and did this amazing randomised trial where we took lutetium PSMA, which is the nuclear warhead component of theranostics, and we used the imaging component to decide which patients would get on, and we compared that to standard of care, what patients were receiving at the time in metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer, and we did a head-on comparison. And that's really came out with astounding results that had impact worldwide and impact for men. And that involved a whole group of people. So it involved ANZUP, but it also involved the Prostate Cancer Foundation, and it involved multiple different funders from around Australia. We managed to get a network of involved hospitals across Australia involved in that trial. So not only did we get amazing results from the trial, but we educated the whole of Australia in what theranostics is, but also how to use it. And it's becoming an increasingly utilised tool across the world for treating prostate cancer. Is now funded in the US and Europe, and working on getting funded in Australia. And then we actually went further than that with the therapy trial, and as you were saying, Lisa, at the recent ASCO, we then presented more data from the therapy trial on how to predict which patients should receive it, which patients should not receive it, how we try and identify which patients are going to best benefit. And then ANZUP's gone even further with the ANZUP trials. So the ANZUP trials where we add combination treatments together. So if we add a treatment to another treatment, do we get more? So can we do 1 + 1 = 5 instead of 1 + 1, one after the other equals 2? And that's also going incredibly well, and we're randomising the last patient this week. So, I can't say enough how much ANZUP has done in terms of promoting theranostics and really what it's going to do.
Fantastic. Arun, you've got a very hard act to follow with that one, but go for it.
I think, Lisa, if I take a slightly different tack, I think, with clinical trials, one of the things that we always focus on the clinical outcomes, which are the most important, but one of the things we can do in clinical trials is value add, and one of the ways we can add trial value to trials is by doing translational or correlative research, where we take blood samples, tumour samples, scans, whatever it might be, and actually try and work out which patients are responding or not responding, and why resistance is developing to these treatments. So, one of the things that's been built into a lot of, really all, but certainly many of the key ANZUP studies is translational research, which is a bit of a sort of general term. But if you look at all the big ANZUP studies, ENZAMED, ENZARAD, in prostate, and then therapy, and then there's all the other tumour streams as well. There are correlative samples or patient samples which have been taken from all those, which will allow us to build on, in many cases, world first, really first in field clinical trials, to do first in field laboratory research that will help us get even more value out of these treatments, so that we work out who's benefiting versus who's not and why, and then understanding resistance. Because, one of the things, for example, with lutetium, is the response rates are very high when you use in the therapy trial. 66% of men had a PSA response. A lot of men responded, but unfortunately, many of those men develop resistance, sometimes quite quickly. And why is that the case? So we take blood samples during the trial that we can analyse and understand the profile of the genomic profile of those men's cancers to help us understand why that's the case, so that hopefully we can design the next trial that helps to overcome that resistance, at least in some of those men. So I think that, there's a lot of, and there's other ways we can add value in terms of quality of life studies and health economics as well, which we can also talk about. But those are really important add-ons, to the clinical trials that ANZUP does, and I think, we'll see as these studies read out clinically, we'll then do the translational research and see some pretty amazing data come out of that phase of the research as well.
Dickon, now for something completely different, because the three of us are kind of prostate super nerds.
But this is one of the problems. So we've already heard that bladder cancer is a cancer that's not doing as well as some of the other cancers, and it does tend to be one that's less in the public eye. It's a male and female a bit cancer. It affects people who are elderly. It affects people who are smoking. It doesn't tend to it's not a big enough cancer to get its own sort of it's one of the common cancers, but it's a bit too common to be rare. So it always falls between the hoops, and we're not seeing great outcomes for bladder cancer. Now, ANZUP's very active in bladder cancer trials, and in fact, at the moment, we've got a very large trial. It's actually the largest bladder cancer, non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, so the early bladder cancer trial that's currently recruiting in the world. And that's looking at two previously quite standard treatments, but used together in combination, similar to what Louise was saying, to hopefully that 1 + 1 = 5, applying a very commonly available treatment, something called BCG in the bladder, but then also adding chemotherapy as well, both which are used on their own in bladder cancer very frequently, but used together may have a much bigger effect. So that study is nearly recruited, so we're excited about that. And there are new treatments emerging as well in that field that we may be able to add in after that. So that's very exciting. In terms of penile cancer, we haven't really. This is something that that is genuinely a very rare cancer. It's a hard cancer to get people to say out loud. And one of the points of naming the BUP committee to include penile cancer is to try and give that some ease of access for people. But we have got some work being presented at this meeting related to penile cancer, and indeed some new projects that are going on in that space as well. So there's lots to do, but we're certainly doing quite a bit.
What do you see from each of you is, can you talk about how consumer engagement in research has changed how you've designed trials? What does our consumer input, how does it positively affect what we do? Louise?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that, because when we were designing a variety of trials, like the primary trial is a trial where we're looking at using PSMA PET to improve diagnosis in prostate cancer. And really a lot of the impact for that and the endpoints for that came from talking to consumers and people sort of saying how they not only do they want to improve diagnosis of prostate cancer, but in fact how they wanted to not be diagnosed with prostate cancer, that whole survivorship thing. Wouldn't it be great if you had a tool where instead of being told that you had you didn't really had cancer, but you had a low-grade cancer that was going to have to be followed and you'd have to have a biopsy every 2 years. What in fact if you could have a tool that meant that you never got the diagnosis in the first place and you didn't have that associated anxiety. So that was one thing. And then actually for the ANZUP trial, it was superb. I had the most wonderful consumers who actually helped me write the grant and had so much input. I'm forever grateful to them.
Arun?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of things we could say. I mean, there's real sort of detailed things when you're developing a protocol, when you're thinking, well, how many, talking about doing these blood samples to do translational research, like how many samples can we really take, from men, and like the time points that are realistic for prostate studies, obviously. And so asking our consumers, well, is that reasonable if you do this 2 or 3 or 4 times? I mean, there's and asking them what they think is reasonable, because it's easy for us to say, oh, we just request blood tests, but we're not the one there actually giving the sample. So I think there's that side of it. I mean, there's the sort of real, which is very granular, and then there's the other side of it, which is understanding what are the questions that are important. And, the number of times when you give a treatment, and, many of our treatments in medical oncology work well initially and then stop working. And so when you hear, the question coming from, patients and their families, well, what can you do next? What can you do better to make, so this doesn't happen to the next person? I think that's a sort of a drive to sort of understand why that treatment has stopped working, and what trial we can design next, and what sort of research we can do off that trial to come up with a better answer. So I think when you see that question, I think just the experience that our patients and consumers go through is a reminder constantly of, the ups and downs, a reminder of why we do what we do, and I think help drive us to do trials. I mean, doing trials is not straightforward, and all the other research is not straightforward, but I think the patient experience and consumer experience gives us that motivation to push forward.
Yeah, so we've been talking already about how the consumers are involved literally at each, from the concept development all the way through trial progression. And I'll just give an example of where it was the consumer impact that almost completely changed the interpretation of the study. So we were looking at a study within an inhaled anesthetic agent when you're having a prostate biopsy. And we have something in trials called your prime outcome measure, which is basically the main one that you're looking at, that you're going to power your study on, that you're going to get your answer from, your p-value. We love to talk about all that. But there were a whole load of other secondary outcomes. And it was really the framing of how important those secondary outcomes were, maybe more than the primary outcome to the consumers on the panel. It really changed how we interpreted the study, and indeed how we reported it. So I think, look, it's absolutely essential, because it really is about the outcome for patients. So yeah, the consumers at every level of the trial are so essential.
I actually wanted to add one other thing, and that's to do with ongoing advocacy. So you can do trials and you can show that treatments are really, really important. But one of the things that actually incredibly moving for me is how, when we're trying to talk to government to try and help get these things funded, moving on from the trials. I have patients on a lot of the trials they've advocated to government. I've got one gorgeous patient who has written to over 105 MPs, has met the finance minister, has met, and I can't do that. That can only come from the community and from engaged consumers, and it's incredibly moving.
Mm. I think I would also add that at ANZUP, with the consumer advocate panel, that it is essential to have the panel engaged, and I'm sure in this session there's been more discussion about that. But the thing that I've really, apart from the fact that it's incredibly important to hear people's opinions, the number of times I've gotten a patient information sheet back and they've gone, yeah, that doesn't make sense. And if you're a medical oncologist and you're handing out a clinical trial patient information sheet, and as my first ever consumer who's worked with me now for 10 years said, if you don't it's like a novel, if you don't grab the patient in the first page, they're not going to read the rest. And it's so true.
Just to make a practical point on that, so there's been something I certainly support is an increased use of brochures along with an actual. So look, there is kind of a necessity to genuinely inform about every risk that you may be taking and all the side effects, and certainly some people will want to go through that. But you can have a truncated, much more digestible brochure, which also goes to the ethics committee to approve as well, which for the people who really want to just understand what the study's about, and they really don't want to know about the 1 in 10,000 risk of thrombocytopenia, whatever that might be, that's sometimes a better option as well.
I'm still looking for questions from the floor. No? We do. Fantastic.
Louise, you brought up collaboration, and Arun, you brought up translation. Can you just talk about how those things have changed a lot in the last few years and how it benefits the programs, the researchers and the consumer?
Actually, I was really listening to everyone and totally agreeing with what he was saying in terms of we collect all this data as we go. And in fact, we collect a mountain of data. And one of the things that we've done, certainly in a lot of the trials that we've done across Australia, is we've collected imaging data. Because, you know, it's really interesting we take these images, but we don't really know how to use them. And so what we do is we collect everything that we do, everything. And then, you know, 6 months on, 12 months on, you'll suddenly come up with this idea, or you suddenly think of something that we hadn't been doing. And then we've got all this translational data, we've got the blood, and we've got the images, which means that we can continue to iterate and improve what we do. I think that's something that these collaborative groups are doing incredibly well. And so we have huge banks of data that we can go back to and keep analysing so we do better.
Yeah, I agree. Look, I think one of the things that used to happen with sort of so-called biobanks or biorepositories where you collect samples and they'd go in there, is it was like a one-way deposit. It never came out. Nothing ever came out of them, and there's nothing more useless than a sample that just sits there in a freezer that people can't get out. So I think, you know, one of the things is because the questions that arise, because the questions you're trying to answer with those samples, whether it's scans or blood tests or blood samples or tumour samples, are so important to designing the next trial and using existing treatments even better, is if you don't actually use those samples that patients have so generously donated, you know, because it is theirs, then you're missing a huge opportunity. And you're also letting down, you know, we're the custodians of them as the investigators and ANZUP, but you're also doing a disservice to the patients who've actually given it. That's theirs. So they've given us it's their you know, it's your property. So so we have to use them to help not just our patients and consumers now, but also our patients and consumers going forward. So I think there's been a different mindset there where, you know, this idea that you just keep a biobank with a freezer in some dark dungeon for 20 years with 1 million samples, I don't think that's happening as much anymore. We're really looking to use those the samples that we've got to help deliver better patient care going forward.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, there is a balance between, you know, it's always great to have a bit of everything at every time point, but there's actually real hassle to the consumer in terms of providing those samples. So samples that are collected anyway, where you can keep a bit or use a bit more, I think most reasonable people are quite happy for researchers to do whatever with those, and that's fine. But when it's an extra visit, you know, in Western Australia, that might be a very long trip. You know, if it involves another trip, another sample, another biopsy or something like that, it's sometimes a bit different. So there's obviously a balance between how much you can ask and how much you should ask.
I should say patients are extremely generous. You know, certainly when you're collecting your blood samples already, for example, as part of standard of care laboratory tests, and then you ask for a bit more for translational research, virtually no one says no. I mean, I think tumour biopsies sometimes, depending on where the samples have been taken from, can be more difficult. But again, the generosity of patients is remarkable in these situations.
So at this point, I would like to thank all of our speakers for their time and for their insights. And I think on behalf of the speakers, I would like to thank all of you as our consumers. I see members of the ANZUP CAP here, but I know from talking to people that some of you are consumers in research for different research groups around the country, around Adelaide and around the country, and we thank you enormously for your time. And for those of you who want to get involved, there are lots of opportunities, and I really hope you come and join us and help us on this journey. Thank you very much.